Bill McCarthy joins me now from our Ottawa studio. Thank you so much for joining us here on Canada Tonight.
Good evening. Good evening, Travis. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. It is a pleasure to have you on. I know what is likely a very difficult time for you because you knew the former Prime Minister so well. How did you first meet Brian Mulroney?
Oh, dear. I did a contract in 1984, just before the election campaign, and I was hired to help with some candidate photos, pretty much out of the blue. And I was a totally non-political person, without a doubt. Anyway, I did the first contract, and the people at the party were happy with my work. And eventually I did more and more work and became a caucus photographer when they won in '84, and then eventually moved into PMO.
We're looking at some of these incredible pictures that you took through the years. I mean, really moments in history of this country. Most people don't know this. I didn't even know this until today, but your son, Adam Scotty, is the official photographer for the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and I'm on his Instagram. I've met him when I was traveling with our current Prime Minister, and he said this, growing up listening to my father's stories of the boss, thank you to the Mulroney family for all they have given to us and Canadians. Do you mind sharing some of those stories of the boss?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that he was incredibly kind and respectful of everybody around him. We had an incredible team of people that worked in the Prime Minister's office, and Mr. Mulroney and Mrs. Mulroney treated us all with the utmost of respect. And that's kind of what I'll remember the most with his children. As the photographer, you're expected to do the photos, but you don't participate in anything. So you're the fly on the wall.
Right.
And that's the way it should be. For me, the biggest privilege was that I was never asked to leave a room by Mr. Mulroney, no matter what he was discussing officially with any president around the world or other world leader, or with premiers in Canada during the constitutional stuff. I was never asked to leave a room. And he actually had a phrase when somebody would make a note of me being in the room saying, "Don't you think he should leave?" He'd always say, "That's okay, it's only Billy. Anything you say in front of me, you can say in front of Billy." And that trust is enormous. And I'm from a small town in Newfoundland called Grand Falls, Windsor. And he was quite aware of my roots, like he's from a smaller town, pulp and paper towns. And I will always cherish the fact that he gave me such unlimited trust.
Incredible. And I mean, you were able to see the world through a lens, quite literally, in a perspective that most people will never know. Were there moments where you kind of stepped back and thought to yourself, wow, where am I right now?
I'll tell you, the first time you walk into the Oval Office, you'll never forget it. And I can certainly say that, the Kremlin with Mr. Gorbachev, 10 Downing Street with Mrs. Thatcher, I saw these people on a regular basis, and I was, quote, always around, so they would start to recognize me and interact with me a little bit. "You're Brian's photographer, right?" "Yes." "Nice to see you again." All that very polite stuff, and you cherish that. And by example, Mrs. Bush, the first Mrs. Bush, Mrs. Mulroney insisted I show her a photo of her son, who had this great big head of curly red hair. And Mrs. Bush fell in love with the photos of Adam. So every time I went to the White House or would see the Bushes in a G7 summit, she would walk over to me and say, "So, Mr. Photographer, do you have a picture of that little redhead?" It's very sweet.
It definitely is. And what did you notice when you were, in those private meetings behind the scenes with world leaders about the former Prime Minister's ability to connect with them and build that relationship that he had that so many people have spoken of?
Well, I think anybody who's met him and certainly worked with him, I would say that Mr. and Mrs. Mulroney had the same quality. When they looked at you, it was like you were the only person in the room. And you could be in a ballroom with 300 people shaking hands, but when they spoke to you, you had their undivided attention because they were interested and they cared. And so with the world leaders, they established relationships very quickly. But what I noticed the most was how much mutual respect there was. Mrs. Thatcher was one of my favorites. She was always very kind to me. And the Prime Minister surprised her with the Montreal Canadiens hockey jersey one time. And she was tickled pink that he had given her this hockey jersey for her grandson. And on the back of that jersey, it says Thatcher #1. But she was over the moon. And in time, I eventually had a baseball that I got at a baseball game in Toronto, and with the first George Bush, and I got him to sign it, and then I got Joe DiMaggio to sign it, and I got, I forget who else, Ted Williams, and I traveled with this baseball. So Mr. Mulroney, out of the blue, he always knew if it was an important event, I'd have the baseball in my pocket. And he'd look at me and say, Billy, where's your baseball? And he'd literally hand it to Mrs. Thatcher or to Gorbachev or Helmut Kohl of Germany. And he'd then ask for a photo. Billy, show Helmut a picture of Adam. And they would sign the baseball, not to Adam, but they would mix both together. And that's just very touching. When you have somebody who's that busy and occupied, he always remembered to say, Billy, where's that baseball?
We're looking at a photo of you and Adam right now. Quite incredible. You know, I was talking to, I think it was Sheila Copps yesterday, who was mentioning he would always, you know, start speeches by, you know, talking about Mila and I. That relationship that he had with his family and particularly his wife. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Yes, they were incredibly connected. They both absolutely love their kids, and I would never refer to just Mr. Mulroney. For me, it was always Mr. and Mrs. And for a lot of people, they say Brian and Mila. Well, for me, it was always Mr. and Mrs. And they were always so much fun. And I can tell you, she used to pinch him from behind for photos in front of the press just to see if she'd get a reaction from him. And it was the most funny thing to watch because I knew what was happening. And he would try to keep a straight face, and usually he did. But it was just a little impish thing that they did together. And it was always in front of me, and I appreciated that. And I understand that there was actually a point where you were privy to a moment where he promised not to run again. Indeed. It was during the constitutional talks. There was a one-week meeting happened in Ottawa where they were trying to save Meech Lake. It started for one night, went on for a whole week. And after that meeting, a few days later, I think Newfoundland and Manitoba had to ratify what this agreement was. However, we ended up going back to Sussex at one point, and Nicholas was actually sick in bed in his bedroom. So he said, Billy, come on, let's run upstairs and see Nicholas. We walked in, and Mrs. was sitting there writing a letter. So he spoke to Nicholas, and then he started talking to Mrs., and she said, Brian, how's it going today? And he got into some detail, but he did say, now, Mila, I promise you, whether this works or not, I will not run again. And then they both looked at me, realizing I was in the room. And both of them smirked and never said another word about it, but they knew there's no way in the world I would ever repeat that. Because you had that trust. Exactly. I know that there's another story, which I don't know if you can tell us quickly about you being at the White House. I know that you talked about the first time that you went into the Oval Office, but there was another time where a president got you a beer? Yes. Just before the Gulf War started, we went down last minute for a briefing, and we all knew it was going to start. We didn't know when. So got to the White House, get up to the private quarters, and President Bush offers Mr. Mulroney to go to the washroom to, freshen up a bit, and Brian and I will meet you in the living room. So after Mr. Mulroney went into his room, the president turned to me and said, would you like a beer? And I said, and I didn't know what to say. So I looked at his photographer, and President Bush said, well, no, I'm not asking Valdez, I'm asking you. And I said, well, Mr. President, I'd love a beer. Off he went, and 10 seconds later, I had a beer. I'm standing in the hallway with just the other photographer, Dave Valdez, and Mr. Mulroney comes out, walks up to me, totally straight-faced, and goes, Bill McCarthy, it never ceases to amaze me how quickly you make yourself at home. Turned and walked away. And he could deliver a one-liner like there was no tomorrow. You've got so many stories. I want to ask you this to end off. What do you think the lasting imprint that Brian Mulroney will have on your life is?
Well, for me, it will be truly how humble he was. He loved his roots, and we shared that small town thing. He loved his family immensely and cherished his time with his family. And he was a great, very proud Canadian. And if you look at old photos of him signing documents, important documents, he always used a black pilot fine liner that was available to any civil servant in Canada. It was always in filing cabinets. But even though they'd have these ceremonial pens, he would always pull his pilot out to sign it. And that was just his way of keeping his feet on the ground and reminding himself he was, quote, just another Canadian who happened to have a really good job.
Indeed. Bill McCarthy, really appreciate you chatting with us this evening. That is Brian Mulroney's photographer during his time as Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.